Okay, so the purpose of this specific lecture is more of a summary of a number of different terms, some topics, and an overview of the mechanisms of evolution. It's not going into anything in particular in detail. There are separate lectures that go into a lot more detail on many of the different things that I'm talking about here. This is just to kind of put some of them together, right? So what have we covered so far? In the class, we looked at cellular mechanisms for creating genetic diversity. So at meiosis and crossing over and looking at genetics and Mendelian genetics and population genetics, how there can be different versions of genes called the alleles. There could be different percentages of them in the populations, and that certain things can affect them to change the percent of one allele over another. Right, so kind of talking about genetic variation, okay, and genetic diversity. So organisms have different possible genetic outcomes that are just natural, based on how the alleles are assorted. Recombination can allow a variety of different combinations to occur. There can then be mutation, right, where outside factors can cause genes to change and create completely new versions of genes that didn't exist before. If they are harmful, the organism dies. If they're not harmful, they stay. If they're not harmful and they stay, they may cause nothing at all. Nothing may happen different to the organism, or they may provide some sort of advantage to that organism in some ways. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about now. Like, what do you mean by advantage? What types of things could you have an advantage over other individuals for, as we'll look at. So, selection. Organisms in the environment that are different may be selected on by nature. So we're talking about natural selection in different ways. An example, right? There is a classic story of a moth called a peppered moth during the 1800s, right, in England. And let's see, so it's genus and species, just so because we talked about that already. Sorry, I'm writing the genus name there for the species name. Piston patularia. If you want to look this up, also called the peppered moth. All right. And now, the peppered moth had these two different forms, same species. One form is a very light color, so I kind of have the way I'm drawing this here. This is, say, a tree with like a birch tree with like white bark, right, with dark spots on it. And so the moths had light coloration with dark spots. And so when they were sitting on these trees, they're hard to see by predators. The other form was a dark form, so mostly all completely dark and would stand out against the light bark of the tree. So at a certain point in time in the beginning of the 1800s, there were large numbers of the very light colored moths, and the dark color was very rare. Hardly ever saw them. As the Industrial Revolution in England went on and coal fired created a lot of pollution in the air, the bark of these trees from the pollution became dark. So the bark itself becomes really dark. And what happens is, as the bark is very dark, now the dark colored moths are more camouflaged, and the light colored moths stand out against the dark bark. So what happened is, beginning of the 1800s, lots of light colored moths, very few dark ones. End of the 1800s, beginning of 1900s, very rare to find any light colored moths. Almost all dark colored moths of this particular species were found, right, in the wild. So the population of this species shifted, right, from one form to another form. The allele frequency changed. So if we go back to thinking of the Hardy-Weinberg, so you would have found a calculated change in allele frequency over time, which shows that something was happening in that population. So this was a selection event, typically based on predation. So birds would eat these moths and they could see them. So camouflage is one potential thing that could help an organism. So having a mutation or a variation that helps you avoid being eaten is going to be an advantage, right? And so predators would be performing the selection process, eating individuals that are either easier to see, slower, or have some characteristic that makes them easier to catch and capture and consume. Another would be competition. Okay, so let's say there were now different types of birds here looking to eat these moths. So this is now a different species of bird. One type of bird, its beak might be more well adapted to eating the moths and the other isn't. Right? So one type of bird might become more successful at eating the moths than the other bird. And so that organism would have an advantage. Right? So the idea here is that organisms are going to compete for resources. And these are all sorts of resources. So water, nutrients in the soil, different types of food, the sunlight, it would be a resource. So for plants, you're going to see plants are going to be growing in different environments. Even if you just go outside, take a look at an area that's cleared and then plants on the edge of that. A lot of times the plants are growing even at an angle. They're coming toward the light, right? More so, they're going to change even their growth form to move toward the light because that is the resource that they need. And when taller plants shade out lower plants that have high light requirements, the shorter plants aren't going to survive. So the taller plants then would get more sunlight, right? So competition for space on solid surfaces, all these sorts of things are going to be competitions. And there's going to be all sorts of different ways that organisms have to kind of fight with each other for that resource, for space, for a nutrient, for light, for water, all these different kinds of things. There's also going to be, related to this, reproductive competition. So between individuals then of the same species, right? So we have maybe just doing it color-wise. So this is the same species, maybe one's a male, one's a female. Well, among this one particular species, maybe males are competing for females. And so birds, often you'll find this, when you see birds that are colorful, it's almost always the male of the species. The females are much more drab in sort of their coloration. So cardinals, take for example, the red bird. Anyone that's red is a male, right? Female cardinals are kind of a brownish color. They still have an orangish beak, but they are not red, right, like the males. So that's part of competition for mates, advertising. They're trying to advertise, that I'm here. The brighter the red, the coloration, sometimes their wings, they'll do displays, they'll sing songs. Sometimes birds that sing more songs can attract more females. So it's up to the male birds to actually, they're born inherently knowing certain songs that they can sing, but they can also learn songs over time and change up the variation of those songs to become more attractive to females. So there's all this type of competition going on and certain genetic bases of being able to learn the songs, learn them faster, create the sounds, all these different sorts of things are going to affect their success. So, and then finally, on other things, there's many more than this. I said this is more of a summary kind of talk here. Environmental stress. So let's say increasing temperature. Here, maybe the lighter colored moth, for example, is cooler. And the sun, and the darker one is affected more by sun and the heat, right? Because the dark pigment's absorbing more light, which is absorbing more energy, which means more heat. So that might actually harm them. So the coloration could be helpful, right? In this particular case, to environmental change. Some of the temperature variation could have to do internally with things we can't see, like enzymes and how the enzymes work. Some organisms may have enzymes that work at a very narrow temperature range. So temperature and enzyme activity. So some enzymes may work over like a broader range of temperatures, and other enzymes may have a little more narrow range. Kind of weird angle there, but a very narrow range. So they can work, at this particular temperature really well, not so well at these temperatures, but this one can maybe work better at these cooler temperatures. And then maybe there's some other enzyme that works better at some of these warmer temperatures. So as the temperature works up, as the temperature increases, organism, and maybe this is the exact same enzyme, just different versions of the enzyme, and they carry out the same reaction, but these can do it better at colder temperatures. These can do better at warmer temperatures. Here's kind of in the middle. Some are broader. And so organisms with this version of this particular enzyme maybe can still carry out the reactions at cooler temperatures, but not as well. But the higher temperatures actually help them. Whereas the higher temperatures hurt them, and they can't really carry out the reactions anymore. So they die at those temperatures. They don't survive even. So all these sorts of things are just some of the examples of ways that genetic variation has some basis on the organisms, their behavior, how they interact with each other, and how those things can then select for certain genetic features. There's this saying that people attribute to Charles Darwin that is usually misunderstood, okay? Because part of it is about definitions, right? About fitness. What does it mean to be fit? Not what you think, in biology. So biological fitness is not about strength. It's not about, fighting off, another organism, or something like that. It's about, well, the term is fecundity, but it really means the number of offspring that an organism has. So fitness is tied to the number of offspring. So an organism that has no offspring, that doesn't mate and has no children, has zero biological fitness, because that's what the term actually means. So we come back to these things about competition for mates, right? Competition for space. All these sorts of things are going to increase the chance that an organism is going to mate. So these offspring pass on genes to the next generation. If you don't mate, you don't pass on the genes to the next generation, which means you have no biological fitness. So only the individuals in a population who are mating and passing on their genes are going to affect that species and the population of that species in the next generation. Others have no effect on the next generation of the population and what comes after them. Right? So they have no fitness. So survival of the fittest is not about individuals. It doesn't mean that this bird survives because it's stronger. It means that this bird, if it mates, its genes survive into the next generation. Its specific combination of alleles and all those sorts of things survive into the next generation. That's what the survival part is. The organisms, right, who mate more, have more successful offspring, carry on into the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. So in this particular case here, the fittest, right, is who's most well adapted to that surrounding. So organisms who are most well adapted to, say, changing environments. The color of their environment changes, so the light ones are now disadvantaged, the dark ones are advantaged. Okay, so that's the advantage of being a darker color. You're going to survive, not be eaten by these birds. What does that mean? Because you survive, you're going to have more offspring. So it's not that you are surviving, it's that because you survive, you reproduce and then put your genes into the next gene pool, and that carries on. So that's what survival of the fittest means. It means the organisms survive through their offspring, and their genes carry on from generation to generation because they're successful at finding mates, avoiding predators, taking control of the space they're in, competing with others for resources in those spaces. And all those things will make them not only more likely to reproduce, but potentially have more offspring. So they don't just have a few, they mate multiple times and have more offspring and more offspring and more offspring. And so the more offspring they have, the greater their fitness, the greater the biological fitness is for those organisms. So what Charles Darwin did at his time was make a lot of observations of all sorts of things, right? Not just any one particular thing. So he was a geologist to start off with. So he observed fossil record. So he observed, first off, certain things appearing in the fossil record, organisms that maybe he couldn't find, anywhere on Earth, because he did travel around the world looking at all sorts of different types of life, marine organisms in the ocean, plants, animals, all these different sorts of things, and tried to find out, what lived where and document all, which impossible task, really to do, but he was getting a bigger picture than most other people would have, say, at that time. He also then would look at the fossils and kind of compare and say, this organism I don't see anywhere in the world, but it's in the fossil record. So it existed at one point in time, and now it does not exist. You could find things that never existed in the fossil record, and then at some point in time seem to come into existence. Right? They appear in a record, and maybe they do exist still today. So you can kind of find a timeline of when they came about. So this is sort of a story of time and how there's change over time. Many people did not believe that during this particular period in history. They thought, no, everything everything that exists now always existed, always had existed, and always would exist. There's no such thing as new species, and there's no such thing as extinction. That everything just existed. And so Darwin and others, now he's not the only person, many other people proposed ideas of change through time and evolution. The key about Charles Darwin is that he was then collecting evidence, all sorts of evidence. So geological, fossil evidence, biological evidence, collecting birds with different beak types, sampling them. They're the same species of bird, but they have all different shaped beaks. So measuring the beaks of all the different birds, collecting, data to graph it and show like all the different variations within them. Looking at even short periods of time, how there could be change even within a population, a selection event that could shift a population from one form to another form, a type of microevolution, which could lead to larger changes and speciation, new species then resulting from those types of changes. Charles Darwin then proposed his ideas also based on economic texts written by people who essentially just said, for humans, as we compete, for resources with each other, that there is a type of selection that goes on. Right? And Darwin saw this in the natural world as well, just the idea that as populations grow of any species, of plant, animal, anything, that there's a limited amount of resource. It's not unlimited. So whatever that resource is you're thinking about, space or light or water or nutrients, it has some limit. It's not infinite. And there's going to be then competition. And that competition will create selection. Some organisms are going to be better adapted to whatever that competitive pressure is, and then they will be more successful. And the ones who cannot adapt either do not survive or they are not successful. And so as an individual, while they may survive, they don't pass on many genes or any genes into the next generation. And so they start to disappear, right, from the populations. And the population then shifts away from whatever they were. Not only they as an individual, but they as a group no longer exist or exist in very low numbers. Like I said, went from like 90+% of the population being these light-colored moths to, single digit, percentage by the 1900s, of the population of moths being the light color. So really shifting away from one based on something like that. So like I said, I have other lectures that go over some other examples, details of these things separately, but this kind of gives you a bigger overview of the the genetic part as we get into the mechanisms of evolution, and this section is the bridge to the next part of the course where we look at biodiversity. So the next part is we're starting to look at different groups of organisms, what are their characteristics, and then how do they differ from another group. And so then we just kind of go through a tour of life through different groups of organisms. This group, the next group, bacteria, archaea, protists, plants, fungi, animals, different types of animals, different types of plants, and so on. How are they similar? How are they different? It all comes down to this, though, this sort of the genetic basis for that variation, right? For both the relationships of how they are closely related and tied together, and then how they are unique and different. And this is just the beginning of starting to answer the question of why, and how. Why are they different? How are they different? How did this ever occur? If new things come about, and it's sort of the genetic basis with sort of the ecological competition basis. The two things kind of happening at the same time.